long list of stuff that Jen has done, that battle that she has done for all of us on behalf of the movement to end structural violence. She has profound insights that have just touched so many lives. So we're really, really honored that she could come and speak on that level for us today. This is Jen Rose.
I think what I'm doing is a lot easier than what my brother Njoroge just did for us, which is really give us the current global economic context and frame for Mike to be able to talk much more specifically about structural violence, particularly in terms of the violence against women's movement here in the United States and here in Hawaii. And that's what I'm going to focus my thoughts on. But I believe that for all of us progressive peoples doing social change work, what I'm saying I hope applies to other social change movements. So I want to start off with a quote from somebody who I had the privilege of learning from back in my UCLA days, and that's Kimberly Crenshaw. When we don't pay attention to the margins, we don't acknowledge the intersection, where the places of power overlap. We not only fail to see the women who fall between our movements, sometimes we pit our movements against each other. And this is what happens when our movements are pitted against each other. Women lose, people of color lose, we all lose. And I feel like our fabulous Miss Soto's amazing spoken word is all about who's invisible and are we really looking. And I feel like when we see, or when we don't see people, it's because they might have various aspects of their identities that are in the margins, and when there are more aspects of those identities at the margins, the more we fail to see them. So specifically, I'm going to talk about immigrant women, and I want to make it really, really concrete and practical, and I'm going to talk about Hawaii. So I will start off with a real story of a woman, and we have the consent of her and her family to share her story, and then I want to show a visual that will connect to what I see as the kinds of structural violence that have exploited her and have brutalized her. This is a woman who has had the courage to stand up to her batter on many occasions, a woman here in the island of Oahu, who at one point in time was trying to struggle to defend herself when neighbors heard the yelling and the screaming and called the police. When the police came, her batter, who was a U.S. citizen and who spoke English, did all the talking because she could not speak English very well. Her child was not his biological child, but the child of a former partner. And so the police proceeded to listen only to him, despite what was overwhelmingly obvious about the kinds of injuries that she was already displaying at the scene of the crime. And consequently, she signed over voluntarily her child to CPS without knowing what she was doing, because obviously the document was not translated. And her batter said that she was crazy and violent, so she was taken to Kekela. She was in Kekela for 2 weeks before anybody even realized that not only was she not a harm to anybody else or herself, but that she was a battered woman. And it took 2 more weeks to get her child out of CPS. So when we talk about structural violence and we talk about what it means to be on the margins, that's what it looks like in Hawaii. This is a true story that when we brought that story to the legislature, they started listening to us about trying to pass a language access law that basically mirrors what the federal law had said in 1964 in the Civil Rights Act. And it took us 25 years to do that in our democratic nation of Hawaii. So I won't talk about the other legal ramifications of that case. We ended up trying to use the courage of this woman to be able to do some system advocacy and the state level with those various departments, on a policy level with the legislation, but ultimately it came from her voice, and the voices of advocates that were saying, this is not an isolated situation. This is happening every day. And on the neighbor islands, we know women on Maui and on the Big Island who are so afraid of immigrant raids that they're in silence about the fact that they have been trafficked. So We know that as a fact in the Latino community on Maui and the Big Island. And so this is what we're talking about when we're trying to bridge theory and practice. And I will talk from a very personal place because I really appreciate, both activism and the scholarship of people like Njoroge. And I feel like his work is so accessible. And yet when I was struggling as an advocate and an activist doing this work, I didn't know that there were these frames, that could name it for me, so that then I wouldn't feel in so much isolation when I was trying to talk to other service providers, advocates, activists about this work. Because people would come up to me and say, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you talking about culture, or are you talking about immigrants? And I'm saying, I'm talking about oppression, and I'm talking about all of it. And so I felt very marginalized in the work myself. And that's another truth that hasn't been told, which is we women of color and immigrant women who've been doing this work, who've been on the margins, whose stories have not been documented, whose struggles have not been named. In the same way that many of you who were in the room last week when Mario Matsuda talked about public education, that the activists that have come before, and really the movement doesn't begin until we can acknowledge that work that was done. And so I feel like there is a really, really strong disconnect. And I'm not blaming anyone. I think that those of us in academia have a responsibility to make our scholarship accessible. We also have the responsibility to be an academic interpreter of that work. Because you don't know the power of when that work is taken into the field and in the line and on the ground. Because it's not just validating, but it gives us a lingo and a frame to start looking more critically at where it is in doing our work from margin to center that we're really, really messing up. So that's sort of what I'm looking at, and I want to just give a quick. This is done actually by Praxis International, and actually one of our own, Val Kalekanua, has worked very hard on this project, as well as Ellen Pence. And so this is just this is in terms of violence against women. This is just for domestic violence and the systems that a woman will have to go through. But you can also apply it to sexual assault or stalking. So, Ari, if you could just slowly go through the various slides. So this is the criminal justice arrest process. This is a sort of structural violence that you might imagine is happening all along the way with aggressive law enforcement, or when there's no arrest, what happens with the abuse, what happens when there's arrest and bail, and then there is retaliation. And then the next slide is when then her child gets placed in child, and we're talking about the real courageous woman whose story I shared, what happens when she goes through the child welfare system. And then the next slide is the housing map, which I think is actually much more than this. And we know how difficult housing is to find it in Hawaii, just in general, not even including the fact that this is about a woman who may not speak English. And then the next map is the civil protection. If you have both the courage to, or even know that this is a remedy, to file for a restraining order, this is what you might get, and these are all the different stages that you will have to go through. And that's not even talking about the ramifications of when you get a TRO, and once again, either the retaliation that you feel. A lot of immigrant women, when they seek protection orders, they are shocked to find out that their family members actually come to court to support the abuser. And this is because it's the community basically saying, do not out us. And this is a choice that she's forced to make. I wouldn't even call it a choice, would you? Next map is the custody map. So when her child either gets taken away, false accusations of neglect, and then the next map is what it looks like. Her navigating, because it's not a linear thing, she's navigating through all of those systems, all at the same time. And so now put on other layers of race and immigrant status, poverty, and can you imagine even being able to understand